You say dinosaurs are not as old as people think. Can you give me evidence?
Abundant evidence. We find soft tissue in dinosaur bones, things like blood vessels and blood cells. None of these things can survive for millions and millions of years. We even find carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, and that can only be detected for up to a few tens of thousands of years, and also intact fragments of DNA. DNA is a very delicate molecule. It'll break down quite quickly. So there's no way that they can survive for the claimed millions and millions of years. So the evidence is overwhelming that in fact the dinosaur bones are recent. These animals died in the recent past, a matter of only thousands of years ago. That is consistent with the Bible's record of history that has a global catastrophic flood just 4,500 years ago.
I have to ask you the question, how do you get dinosaurs to fit on Noah's Ark?
So the first thing to bear in mind is
Dr. Mark Harwood, you reject the scientific consensus that dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago. Instead, you say T-Rex boarded the Ark about 4,500 years ago, and his descendants went on to fight the medieval knights less than 1,000 years ago. This is a very out-of-the-box view. What evidence do you have to support such a view?
Well, Scott, it is an out-of-the-box view, I agree, and it's not a view that is widely held. But I hold it for three very good reasons. Firstly, scientific reasons. I think there are strong historical reasons. And also we find that the Bible's record of history explains the evidence that we see in the world around us much more effectively than the evolutionary story does.
Okay, Mark, the thing that jumps out to me, I want to go through all of them, but the scientific evidence, because the scientific evidence, surely we are told again and again, and we see it everywhere, the scientific evidence points towards the extinction 66 million years ago. We know there seems to be without doubt that there was this asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula, and that killed out the dinosaurs. And we've got fossil records, and we've got museums full of dinosaur fossils. So you're saying the scientific evidence actually points towards a much more recent extinction of the dinosaurs.
That's exactly what I'm saying, but we get to the nub of the issue here, because all of that evidence which we can observe in the present can be interpreted much more effectively in the light of the Bible's record of history. And the reason that's important is that when people look at evidence, they interpret it in the light of what they believe. So when you say scientific evidence, I just want to make a distinction here. I talk about observable evidence. You mentioned the asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula. We didn't observe that. We were not there. So people look at evidence in the present and they attempt to reconstruct the past. But when you do that, you engage your beliefs about the past. So here we have the crux of the problem, I think. So people look at the evidence, but if they believe the evolutionary story, then they will interpret the evidence in that light. But I believe that the Bible, being God's word, is the truth, and so I interpret the evidence in the light of what it says. So what I find is that the fossil record is best explained in terms of what the Bible describes as a global catastrophic watery disaster in the days of Noah. I find that makes sense of the fossils and how we find them. I think it shows that the dinosaurs show God's amazing creative genius, and it all makes sense. But if you look at it in the light of the millions of years of evolutionary history, there are some profound problems that are just not answerable in that context.
Thanks for watching the interview so far. Just a quick one. If you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button so you can see more of this content. Back to the interview.
So you're first of all saying that your worldview, before you look at the scientific evidence, your worldview shapes how you interpret that. But you're also saying that even objectively, as we look at this evidence, the worldview that fits best with what we see is the biblical one, as opposed to a atheistic, naturalistic worldview.
Yeah, I believe so. I think it does. Well, let me give you some examples. Right?
Yeah.
So one of the most outstanding, brilliant examples is that scientists are discovering soft tissue in dinosaur bones.
Right.
Now, by soft tissue, I mean things like blood cells, blood vessels, proteins, collagen fibres and the like, none of which can survive in a bone for 65 million years, or 66 or whatever the current number is. So that immediately says observable evidence, which I think is real science when you can observe things, measure it and so on, is consistent with a much, much shorter history of the universe, of the Earth in particular.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's pretty amazing. You wouldn't think of soft tissue surviving for such a long time.
Well, it can't. I mean, the laws of physics and chemistry all tell us that it will degrade quite quickly. It's not going to stick around for millions of years. You'd be lucky to get 1 million.
Yes.
Perhaps under ideal conditions.
You're telling me the half-life of, was it DNA, is about 530 years? Is that right?
Oh, it's quite short. Yeah, and DNA, for instance, will break down quickly, and we find fragments of intact DNA inside of dinosaur bones.
Gosh.
So how does that survive? Well, see, there's no satisfactory explanation based on observable science.
Yep.
So people have come up with all kinds of methods of trying to explain this stuff away. Like one suggestion was that perhaps iron in solution can somehow or other preserve soft tissues. But that's been shown not to be the case. It doesn't work. For one thing, iron makes the tissues brittle, and the discoveries have been of soft, flexible, pliable tissue. Iron is reacts quite vigorously. In fact, it increases the rate of degradation and decay. So these things are not helping. So we have this, if you like, great gap between what we observe in the fossil record, in the real world, and what we believe about the past. So our society is pretty much indoctrinated with the whole evolutionary story about how the universe made itself over vast periods of time with unguided random processes. And then when you see evidence like soft tissue and dinosaur bones, it's so dissonant, it's a clash. What do you do with this? It doesn't fit.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit more about this because you've got a number of other evidences, but to me this seems like a very significant one because I know you've talked about, and you might talk about it more, is the carbon-14 in dinosaur bones and how that shouldn't be there.
Yeah, that's another one.
And I'm keen for you to explain that. But and I know the same argument about contamination with carbon-14. Of course, my thought is that's an atomic level, so it's very small. But when you've got a molecular level, which we're talking about here with different soft tissue, collagen, that's much harder to have. My imagination would
even
say
at the level of organisms.
Yeah.
Like blood cells, which is
right.
Not just molecular.
Okay.
I mean, they're huge. Blood cells are very complex, very large.
So it should be fairly basic to establish that this is not contaminated because it's a larger thing. And actually,
well, in fact, just on that, the first discoveries that came out of this that really brought this into the fore were by a paleontologist called Mary Schweitzer. And she published in Science Journal in the 1990s, and she'd found blood cells and so on, and she was roundly condemned. People said, oh, it's complete rubbish, that can't last for millions of years, which is true, it can't. Therefore, your experimental method must have been sloppy. You had contamination, biofilm, things that looked like blood vessels but weren't really. And that was a real insult. And she's a very capable scientist, so she went back and repeated these experiments. In fact, she said, when she first saw this, she said, I didn't believe it. She said, after all, the bones are 65 million years old, which is what, of course, she's been taught. So not unreasonably, that's what she believed.
Yeah, so did she believe contamination? Like when
No,
that?
she didn't. She didn't believe that. But she checked for it, and they were rigorous. And she said, I didn't believe it until we had done it 17 times.
Wow.
See, that's repeatable experiments. That's good science, real science, observation, repeatability.
Yeah, it's the interpretation, which is based on your worldview.
That's right.
But so for her, it sounds like she's got the evolutionary worldview, talking about 65 million years. You can make sense of that. Like, she would be very surprised, that quote you gave. But what did she ever manage to conclude? Why she's seeing that?
I think she still struggles with this because she doesn't accept a biblical timescale of only thousands of years.
Yep.
So she's still, along with many other scientists, searching for some preservation mechanism that can have biological material surviving for millions of years.
Yes.
in spite of the fact that it's contrary to all the laws of physics and chemistry, which we observe in a laboratory. We can do experiments on these things and demonstrate that they decay quite rapidly.
Right.
In fact, she encountered huge resistance. I'd like to share a quote with you, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Because you can imagine the feedback she was getting, which is very negative. But she said this, if I can read this.
Yeah, sure.
I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. Now, this is very telling because, first of all, he knew, right? That means he believed, not that he knew, right?
Well, that says he knew.
Because we're talking about the unobserved past.
Okay,
so he's exercising his belief. So Mary Schweitzer wrote back to him and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none.
Wow. So you're talking about a paper, a peer-reviewed paper.
Yeah.
She's written the paper. She's put it in.
Yep, into a reviewer.
So this is a reviewer who's supposed to be at the top of the field.
Yep, and he's rejecting it.
He's rejecting it. And the reason he rejects it?
Because he doesn't believe it. Now, I thought science was the study of the physical world in a quest to discover truth, right? So that means you would accept all observations and data, would you not?
Yeah, I guess if it's just so out of your paradigm, like that reviewer just must have been like, look, I've worked 20, 30 years in this field and I've seen so many papers and evidence. And
everybody knows it's millions of years old. Therefore, what you're finding is not possible.
Yeah, you need to go back and do the experiment.
Yeah.
I can understand that reviewer. Like, if I didn't do the experiment myself, I don't believe you. But it's because of that worldview.
Yeah, but the statement at the end, remember, was Mary Schweitzer asked him what data would convince you, and he said none.
He's digging his heels in at that point.
So he's shutting his mind to data, observable, experimental results. Doesn't want to know. So can you see the power of our beliefs? See, our beliefs are like a worldview, like a filter that filters everything we see, read or hear, and we test it against what we believe. And there are some things that we just reject outright. Can't be true. And that's what he's doing. But this is observable scientific data. Now, it's not just Mary Schweitzer finding these things. There are something like over 140 different secular scientific papers now reporting soft tissue in dinosaur bones.
Gosh, so this isn't a one-off thing.
No, it's not a one-off. In fact, Wikipedia has a page of reported soft tissue dinosaur finds, and it's quite extensive. So if it's in Wikipedia, it says that it's found its way into mainstream thought now. But back in the 1990s, it certainly had not. So it's been a long haul to try and get some level of acceptance of this observable data into the scientific community. But the other one that I wanted to mention was collagen fibres. There was a paper published in January of 2025, quite recent, in the Journal of Analytical Chemistry, I believe, which was talking about collagen fibres having been found in an Edmontosaurus dinosaur. And this was put forward. It's been through the peer review process. What was interesting about it, there were 7 authors on this paper. 3 of those 7 are biblical creationists. Now, we often hear the criticism that, biblical creationists, they don't do real science. They don't publish in the peer-reviewed material. And yet here we are with biblical creationists being published in secular journals. The reason they're being published is because they're looking at the evidence that they have observed and that they've analysed, and they've constrained the paper to those things. Obviously, they don't speculate on the age of it, because if they did that, then the reviewing system would reject it because it doesn't comply with the accepted view in our culture.
Okay, so it sounds like these things are getting published now, even though Mary Schweitzer's reviewer wouldn't publish hers originally.
That's right.
I think even she herself has many published articles of soft
right.
tissue and dinosaurs, so she'd be a good person to look up. But what you're saying is just the Wikipedia article itself, there's hundreds of references of soft tissues being found in dinosaur bones.
Many references.
Yeah. I think I took a quick look at it, and I took a look at it was a huge page, and right at the end, there was over 300 references. So I don't actually know how many examples there are. There might be one example has many references, but anyway, it's a lot, isn't it? So
Well,
So
another one, Scott, is the presence of carbon-14.
yes,
And
so I mentioned this.
yeah, you
Can
did. And
can
this
you
is
explain?
consistently found in dinosaur bones.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're talking about something which is observable and repeatable experiments, real science, not the sort of storytelling science about the unobserved past, all right? Real science.
And can you tell us why should carbon-14 not be in dinosaur bones according to the
Well,
evolutionary
carbon-14
worldview?
is a radioactively unstable form of carbon, and it decays quite rapidly. It has a half-life of only 5,730 years, which is short compared to some of the other radiometric dating schemes that people use. And for instance, if you had a lump of carbon-14 the size of planet Earth, it would decay away completely, so there's no carbon-14 left in less than 1 million years.
Wow.
So if you found carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone, it cannot possibly be many millions of years old. In fact, in reality, carbon-14 is really only practical as a measuring technique for up to some tens of thousands of years, maybe 60 or to 80. Some people think perhaps 100, but certainly nowhere near 1 million years.
So just to look at the way this works, Mark, you have the carbon-14 in something that once was living, and it decays to...
Nitrogen-14.
Okay, so it decays to something else. So what you're saying is if there was a lump of carbon-14 as big as the Earth, it would decay fully to nitrogen-14
Yeah, in less than 1 million years. So you can't detect any carbon-14
Yeah.
outside of some just tens of thousands of years.
Actually, would it matter the size of the sample? I guess it wouldn't matter, right? Because you...
Well, that's an extreme example, something the size of planet Earth,
Yeah.
right? I'm just trying to make the point here. But in practical applications, you're down to just tens of thousands of years for carbon-14.
Yeah.
But it's nowhere near the claimed age of these bones. That's the point.
Yes, yeah.
And it's found consistently. It's not just a one-off event, which you might be able to argue away through contamination or something, something like that. In fact, there was a conference in 2012 in Singapore. It was held, conference on geophysics, and some authors put forward a paper in which they had analysed a number of different bones from 8 different dinosaur specimens. And they had achieved radiocarbon ages between sort of about 20 to 50,000 years kind of range, which is what you expect, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But that paper caused a great storm to the point where they actually expunged it from the record of the conference, or at least from the index. The paper is still there, you can find it, but it's not discoverable if you look at the contents of the conference. And the reason that the chairman took it out was because they couldn't believe the results.
So there's a paper saying there's carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, and they presented it at a conference. But they got to actually present it.
They did. They got to present it, but then subsequently it was taken out of the record. So the fact that the chairman took that action simply reflects their belief system being confronted. And what do they believe? That the fossils could only be millions of years old. Can you see how this keeps coming back to what people believe? And this is so important. The evolutionary story tells or tries to account for the existence of the universe in purely natural terms. And if you limit yourself to naturalism, you are forced into deep time, the millions and billions of years, because the universe is so staggeringly complex and diverse that it can't happen in just a short time. So random processes, unguided, have to operate over deep time to even have a fighting chance of explaining what we can observe in the world around us. Frankly, I don't believe any amount of time solves the problems, but that's the subject of another discussion. But that's where the deep time belief comes from. Now, if you think about it, if you constrain yourself to only naturalistic explanations, what you're doing is excluding the possibility of a supernatural explanation. So what it's saying is, in effect, there is no God. So the evolutionary story, naturalism, is really just atheism in disguise. So it comes with all the establishment authority of science, and after all, who can argue against the scientists? These are clever guys, you know, they put men on the moon and invent amazing gadgets and what have you. So when they say, oh, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, well, they must be right. But we've crossed a line here. The line is, on one side, we have observable, repeatable experiments. which you do in the present. The other side of the line is what I like to call storytelling science. So you make up a story about the past to explain what you're observing in the present. But if you constrain yourself to naturalism, your story is going to involve millions and millions of years. So inevitably, when they look at these fossils, they see millions and millions of years, because the evolution of dinosaurs fits into this story of the unobserved past that gives us these incredible long periods of time. Now, there's a completely different way of looking at the history of this earth. And I think that what the Bible says is in fact true. And the reason I say that is that the Bible, first of all, claims to be truth. And a lot of people say, oh, that's a self-testimony, so why would you believe that? But the correct thing to do, I think, is to test it, because if it really is the truth, you would not be surprised that it would lay claim to that. So in the opening chapters of Genesis, we discover in chapters 6, 7 and 8, the description of a global catastrophic watery disaster in which God brings judgment onto the face of the earth. It totally destroys the whole surface of the earth. We've got no idea what that original earth was like. It was wiped out and destroyed. All we've got now is the broken remains, if you like, the aftermath of that judgment.
And I want to come on to that with you, Mark, because I want to actually talk about the fossil evidence, because that was something that is actually supposedly, and we're told, is much more in favour of the evolutionary worldview. The dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago.
But the Bible gives an account of this watery disaster, which would have deposited the fossil record.
Yes.
And it gives, I think, a much more powerful way of interpreting the fossil record, and I'll explain why in a minute.
Yeah.
So when you start with the eyewitness account of history, I think you're in a much stronger place. Remember what we said earlier, that the evolutionary story is a story about the unobserved past, which is trying to explain the universe without God. So if you like, it's an atheistic worldview. But if we admit the possibility there is a God, and particularly the God of the Bible, who's given us a record of what he actually did at the beginning, we have a whole new explanatory framework that throws completely different light on the fossil record and how to interpret it. And also why we still find soft tissue in dinosaur bones in the present day, which is not possible if they're millions and millions of years old.
So I do really want to understand the fossil record and how the flood explains us finding these fossils, and compare that with how the naturalistic worldview looks at the fossil record. But first of all, we wanted to talk about DNA being found in dinosaur bones and actually how long that can last, because there has been some scientific experiments or estimates made on this. Is that correct?
Indeed, there have. It's calculated that DNA has a half-life probably in the order of 500 or so years, which is, once again, very short. And in fact, under ideal conditions, you could have some readable fragments of DNA, maybe out to 1 million years, and somebody said once 1.5 million tops. So once again, way, way too short for the claimed age of the dinosaur bones. And yet in those bones, we find readable fragments of DNA. Now, it's not that we're teetering on the brink of another Jurassic Park or anything like that, but it's once again evidence that these bones cannot be as old as they're claimed.
Yes, and I think the example you're talking about, when they say the top is 1 million or 1.5 million years, they're keeping the DNA at -5 centigrade or some very low temperature, right?
Yes, but of course dinosaurs lived in warm climates, right? So the reality is this is only going to be preserved for just thousands of years.
Yes.
But here's the thing, according to the Bible's chronology, the flood took place about 4,500 years ago. So that's quite consistent, and it's quite feasible that you'd expect to find these sorts of things in dinosaur bones if the Bible's record of history is true.
Got you. And how long have they calculated how long the DNA fragments could stay if it was a more temperate environment, like dinosaurs are expected to live at not -5 centigrade? I think the temperature was much higher.
There have been analyses of that, and they range, depending on temperature. The higher the temperature, the shorter the time. So you're talking about just a matter of a few thousand years at normal temperatures, like 20 degrees.
So that'd be more
centigrade.
realistic. Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so really the Bible's timeline fits. Okay, you're not going to get the full intact stretch of DNA or some of these full large samples of soft tissue, but it might have degraded in the thousands of years, but we might expect to find a little bit. And that's what we are finding.
And that's what we're finding. But you see, that's consistent with the Bible's record of history, but it's not consistent with the evolutionary story. So that's why I think there is quite strong scientific evidence which is contrary to the evolutionary worldview and the millions of years. So back to the way you began this interview, yes, I do hold a very contrary position to what is normally accepted, but I do so for sound scientific reasons.
Yeah, I really think the soft tissue is a very strong or convincing piece of evidence that seems to point much more towards the biblical worldview, the evolutionary worldview. And it's amazing that it's out there, peer-reviewed and published.
Yeah. Well, soft tissue and carbon-14.
Yes.
Both of them
you mentioned
point to
carbon-14
yes,
as well.
Both point to a young age.
Yeah. Yeah, but with carbon-14 being slightly less published than, I mean, it sounds like there was someone tried to present it at a conference.
Oh, there's been subsequent publications.
Okay. So people can look up both
People can look it up,
carbon-14
search it,
and soft tissues.
you'll find there's over, as I said, over 140
Yes.
secular scientific papers confirming soft tissue and carbon-14 finds in dinosaur bones.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly, but real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We present at close to 1,000 events each year. So many people struggle with how science and the Bible fit together, and it becomes a genuine stumbling block to their faith. But our speakers present satisfying answers that really make sense. We've received hundreds, possibly thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through our speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today.
So we're still looking at the scientific evidence, and we're going to come on to historical evidence. But before we do, I really want to look at the fossil record. So we've been mentioning the flood explains the dinosaur fossils better than the millions of years. Now, can you just explain what is the traditional view of how fossils are formed, and what is the biblical view of how fossils are formed, and why does that point better towards?
Well, let's look at what we find. You find these huge fossil graveyards, massive numbers of dinosaurs and other mammals and other creatures all swept together, lots of marine fossils with them as well, in huge beds. Now, how do those things happen if the fossils are formed by an animal dying and falling over? In fact, if you think about it, you need special conditions to form a fossil, because if an animal dies, its body rots and decays, scavengers get at it. Before long, there's no evidence it was even there. So to form a fossil, you need to bury the creature deeply. Otherwise, predators are going to come and dig it up and eat it. You need to limit the amount of oxygen that can get to it so it doesn't rot away. So that speaks of a rapid, deep burial process, but that's not what we see happening in the world today. The fossil record shows evidence of things happening very, very quickly. There's a classic one that many people would doubtless have seen of an ichthyosaur, which is an extinct marine reptile, in the act of giving birth. Now, that speaks of a rapid burial. Another one, I've got several of these, of a fish in the act of eating another fish.
It's fossilised like that.
It's fossilised, okay.
Wow.
So this is not slow and gradual. But the kind of stories we get, things you'll find in biology textbooks, for instance, or on interpretive signs, tell a story of how, for instance, in the case of a fish fossil, the little fish is swimming happily along, dies, sinks to the bottom of the river or lake, some sediment gets swept in, slowly covers the body, and then many, many years later someone discovers the fossil. But that's not what happens in reality, of course, because in the case of fish, if they die, well, other fish will eat them. For a start, they'll probably float to the top, not sink to the bottom. Before long, there'll be just a few bony remains, and even the crustaceans get rid of those. So, this is intuitively obvious. You can check it out. Next time you go down to the ocean, go swimming, snorkeling, look down at the ocean floor. Will you see all those dead fish lying there waiting to become fossils? It's not like that, is it? So the whole fossilisation process speaks of something that is rapid and dramatic.
Like Noah's flood.
Not like Noah's flood.
And if we're talking about not burying a fish, but burying a T-Rex or a sauropod.
Well, then you need massive amounts of sediment all at once. But here's the thing, the implied sedimentary rates from the evolutionary timescales are way too slow. Like the geologic column is about 2,000 metres deep, and you've got all these layers and layers of sedimentary rock, right? From the present all the way back to the Cambrian is about 541 million years, we're told.
Okay, so 2,000 metres.
2,000 metres deep, and it's been
541
deposited
million
over
years.
540-something million years, right? So do the arithmetic. That tells you that the average rate of sedimentation is something like 0.004 of a millimetre per year.
Right, that's not going to bury anything.
Well, no, it's not, exactly. In other words, to put it another way, it would take 250 years to produce 1 millimetre of sediment.
Yeah.
So how do you bury a T-Rex at that rate? The body would rot and long since gone.
So you need a lot happening at once, and
Exactly.
then not happening for a long time in their worldview, right?
So let's say you deposit a 100-metre thick layer of sedimentary rock. That's going to take, at that average rate, 25 million years, right? So if it all happened rapidly, you've just taken 25 million years out of your 540. And that's only one layer. But these sedimentary layers are typically many metres thick. So what that would suggest is that it must have happened in a sort of punctuated way, a sudden rapid deposition to produce the fossils, and then a very long period before the next one. So the time must be in the gaps between the layers, right?
Okay, yeah. So what you're saying is they also have rapid floods or burials, but it happens in a period.
Yep.
And then you have a period where
a long period, nothing happens.
There has to be absolutely nothing.
Yeah,
almost.
absolutely nothing, right? And then the next layer, so that you get an average 540 million years over 2,000 metres of sediment, say, right, to produce that average.
Yeah.
So that means the time has to be in the gaps. But here's a problem. The gaps are what they call flat. So the boundaries between many sedimentary layers are flat. They're very, very sharply defined. There's no evidence of erosion. So how do you have a layer of rock lying there for millions and millions of years? Obviously, it's going to rain. There'll be rivers, creeks, valleys, gullies would form. How can you suggest there's no evidence of erosion? But there isn't. So that suggests there's very little time, if any, between the layers forming. Not only that, you have what are called ephemeral fossils. Things like ripple marks. I was in Kalbarri National Park in Western Australia some years ago, and I've got a photograph of ripples. Now, if you're down at the beach somewhere and you see ripple marks in the sand, how long do they last? Well, only until the next tide, right? So if there are ripple marks there, to preserve them, you have to cover it very quickly. So you can't have a lot of time. And things like...
And you're saying those ripple marks and ephemeral fossils are in the layers where there's supposed to be the time.
That's right.
Got you. So they say, okay, there's a quick burial or a quick large amount of sediment produced. Because again, what we were saying, that it's 2 kilometres worth of sediment needs to be done in
540 million years.
540 million years. So you have to have...
Very slow.
Yeah. So you have a sudden bit, and then you've got nothing for a long time. But what you're saying is in those nothing gaps, there's first of all no undulations. Second of all, there's ephemeral fossils going through them. So
that says there's no time in the gaps.
Yeah.
So if there's no time in the layers, because they were deposited quickly to form the fossils, and there's no time in the gaps, there's no time in the rocks. But here's the thing. People look at the rocks and say, oh, look at the millions of years that must have taken to deposit. But that's not what the evidence actually says. That's a story about the unobserved past.
Yes.
A story which begins by believing there's no God and we're constrained to naturalistic explanations. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if there is a God? What if that God is the God who's revealed himself to us in the Bible and has given us an accurate record of history? So now you've got a radically different way of looking at dinosaur fossils. Okay, so they're buried in these thick layers because they're very big animals. We find them jumbled together, which you would expect to find if there was a catastrophic flood that occurred. But you also find them in a particular position that is so common, it's called the dinosaur death throes position. And paleontologists are perplexed, why are so many dinosaurs in this position? And it's a position where the animal's neck is arched back, often the mouth is open, the arms and legs outstretched, tail extended. It's called the opistotonic posture. And it's a position that the animal gets into immediately prior to death through acute oxygen deprivation by suffocation or drowning. Now, if people would go back to the history book of the universe, they would have a good idea why so many dinosaurs are in this position. Because it makes sense of the observations, a global watery disaster that happened rapidly.
Epistotonic pose, is that correct? Am I saying it correctly?
Epistotonic
Epistotonic
posture or pose.
Yeah, so people might have not heard of this before, but if you've been in museums looking at dinosaurs, certainly for me, once you pointed this out to me, I'd see, I have seen dinosaurs in that position before. And in fact, you've got a great picture from a museum where you and your wife visited, and you've put your wife next to it for scale in the photo. It's this huge, is it a T-Rex that's in this?
Yes, it's a T-Rex, and I think we'll put the image up so people can see it.
Excellent.
But you can see that the neck is arched backwards, the mouth is open, legs and arms outstretched, tail's extended.
Yes.
So it's the position an animal gets into under acute oxygen deprivation.
But first of all, people didn't understand that for a while. Is that correct? I think my understanding is they saw all these dinosaurs.
Well,
in
they
this
were
position.
curious. Why are so many in this position?
Yes.
Right. And so they're trying to come up with a reason, an explanation. But sadly, most of these people reject the history book of the universe, which I think is what you could think the Bible as being. And so they don't accept the concept of a global catastrophic flood as described in Genesis. But if you allowed that into your thinking, you have a very ready and powerful explanation for why this dinosaur death throes position is there. Of course, when you go to museums, often the bones are reassembled with the animal in the standing position so you can see how big the creature is. But it's when you see the exhibits of how they actually found them that I think it's much more interesting. That's where you see the posture.
So, Mark, why does this death pose that we often find these dinosaurs in the fossil record, why does that point more to the Bible's record of history, specifically the flood, as opposed to an evolutionary worldview?
Well, it's a position that's consistent with what happens to an animal when it drowns or is suffocated, buried under heaps of sediment or drowns in water. This is a classic pose that the animal gets into. So it's consistent with the Bible's record of history, but very hard to explain if you have the millions of years kind of model, animals dying and falling over and somehow or other being covered. Why are they in this epistotonic posture? It really isn't a particularly credible explanation. And it's so common, it's called the dinosaur death throes position. So there are lots of different attempts to explain it, but no one has come out yet with any kind of a satisfactory naturalistic model. But it certainly is consistent with what you'd expect to find if the Bible is true about Noah's flood.
Great. Okay, so we've so far covered scientific evidences, and you talked about carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, soft tissue in dinosaur bones, DNA, collagen, and also talking about the fossil record itself is actually interpreted under a biblical lens, proves that that's a much better way of looking at the fossil record.
Well, I think it's much more logical, and it's a far more powerful explanatory framework than trying to factor in millions of years of slow, gradual processes, which is the evolutionary perspective.
Okay. So I want to move us on to history now, because you mentioned history. And what do you mean by history? You're talking about historical written evidence?
Yes, written evidence, but also depictions of creatures that I think are best interpreted as being dinosaurs. For instance, my wife and I visited the city of Carlisle in northern England. And in Carlisle, like most English cities, there's a cathedral. And if you go into the cathedral, between the choir stalls, there's the tomb of a guy called Bishop Bell. And he was buried in 1496. And around his tomb is a magnificent brass inlay that shows all these etchings and images of various kinds of animals, common, ordinary animals. There's a dog, a bird, an eel, a fish, and so on. And then in the middle of them all are these two creatures with long intertwined necks and large tails, one of which has bony protrusions on its tail. Now, they're not the sort of animals we see wandering around today, but they fit the description or what we see from the fossil record of sauropod dinosaurs. So I think they're highly likely to be sauropods. Now, what's even more interesting is that the artists depicted the tails as being held aloft. Now, these are huge tails and these are huge animals. Now, when sauropod dinosaurs were first presented in museums and in drawings and so on, they were often depicted with their tails dragging because the tails were so big. But then as paleontologists examined the bones more, they realised, no, actually, they held their tails aloft. So the depictions then changed, and now we see them with their tails held aloft. But isn't it interesting that 500 years ago, before paleontology was a thing, these artisans were depicting these animals with their tails aloft, which says to me they most likely had actually seen them.
And so this was, and you visited about 10 years ago to this place, Carlisle Cathedral. And so when was it built again? And when were these engravings done?
I don't know when the cathedral was built, but the tomb
Yes.
is 1496.
Okay.
That's when Bishop Bell was buried there.
So there's these engravings of what look like sauropods. And so we're just going to put an image of that on screen so people can have a look at that. And these are your pictures, Mark.
Yes,
Yeah,
they
you took
are.
them. And so that what we're saying is that these images look like sauropods, and it was done in 1496. So you're saying that possibly these people saw these sauropods, and that's how they drew them so accurately.
Well, I think it makes sense, doesn't it? How would they have fortuitously have conjured up such an accurate depiction of a sauropod dinosaur, which we didn't know about for a long time later, like it was in the 1800s that people started to put full skeletons together of these things and understand their size and what they were like. So here we have hundreds of years beforehand an accurate depiction.
And so people can see on the pictures there that there's also some other animals depicted on this brass.
Which are accurately
engraving.
depicted, which you can recognise immediately.
Yeah. So the argument is, well, why would there be this? Because I guess in the medieval times, you could have said, oh, this was a mythical creature. So you say, why have a mythical creature along with these?
Along with all these other ordinary creatures.
Rules.
Another example of that is the Chinese calendar. The ancient Chinese divided their calendar in a cycle of 12 years, and they're named after common, ordinary, everyday animals. There's a year of the dog, the rabbit, the ox, and so on. But in the middle of them all is the dragon. So why would the ancient Chinese choose 11 common, ordinary, everyday animals and then pick a mythical one? I think far more likely they had encountered creatures that they call dragons. Now, here's an interesting thing. It's highly likely, I believe, that what the medieval people called dragons were what we would call dinosaurs.
Okay.
In fact, there's an excellent piece of work has been done by a guy called Vance Nelson, who travelled the world looking at depictions of dragons on castles, in carvings, tapestries, paintings, and so on. And he's shown how they correlate with the likely body shapes based on the fossil record of various kinds of dinosaurs. So it's kind of, if you like, corroborating the shapes of these creatures that have been recorded by people who observed them. Now, some of the depictions of dinosaurs do get a little bit stylistic and probably a bit overstated, a little bit like the fisherman describing the one that got away. It gets a bit bigger.
You mean the depictions of dragons?
Yeah, depictions of dragons, and they're a
Yeah.
bit more fierce, and maybe they didn't all fly with wings and all this sort of stuff. But broadly speaking, there's a high correlation between these depictions and what we find in the fossil record.
I guess if you were a medieval knight coming back with a story of slaying a dinosaur, you might embellish some of the details to
you could
improve
well,
your
that's right.
how you looked. Wow. So it's that. I mean, is there any other evidence that points to that? Because you're saying that basically the myths and the legends of dragons, people were actually seeing dinosaurs.
I believe they were, yeah. So I think you could summarise it by saying that the dinosaurs of history are really one and the same as the dragons of legends.
Okay, and the thing, I have looked a little bit at that book you were talking about, the Dire Dragons.
Dire
book,
Dragons,
and
that's right.
That's a very convincing, I was going to say read, but it's actually, you just need to look at the pictures.
Yes.
Because what he's got there is on one side, he has the medieval art that he's took a photo of, travelled all around the world. And on the other side, he's employed evolutionary artists to draw the picture of the dinosaur that he thinks the medieval art looks like. So we as the reader can compare the two.
Yes.
It says the medieval artists, draw a Meiosaurus plebisaurum or like a juvenile Meiosaurus looking to the left, just like he thinks this medieval art is. And suddenly you see,
you see the correlation.
They're very similar.
It's very powerful.
I remember
isn't it?
looking at that and thinking, wow, that's very convincing.
But it's not just these sorts of depictions. There are also written records, which are very important.
Okay.
For instance, Marco Polo. Let me share a quote with you from his book that he wrote on his travels. And let me just find that. It's in his diaries. Now, Marco Polo was an explorer, lived in the middle 1200s to early 1300s. And he writes this: "In this province live huge snakes and serpents of such a size that no one could help being amazed even to hear of them. They are loathsome creatures to behold. They have enormous heads and eyes so bulging that they are bigger than loaves. Their mouth is big enough to swallow a man at one gulp." Now that gives you a size at the scale of this thing, right?
Wow.
It's not just a big snake. It just swallows a man in one gulp. Their teeth are huge. All in all, the monsters are of such inordinate bulk and ferocity that there is neither man nor beast but goes in fear of them. They go to the dens where lions and bears and other beasts of prey have their cubs and gobble them up, parents as well as young.
Wow.
Now, this is a description from an explorer who has come across these extraordinary creatures. But that's not inconsistent with what we know of the more ferocious of the dinosaurs, like a T-Rex or something, with huge teeth and so on. There's another chronicle from 1405, and it says here, close to the town of Burrs near Sudbury, so I gather this is in the United Kingdom, there has lately appeared, to the great hurt of the countryside, a dragon, vast in body, with a crested head, teeth like a saw, wow, that's just really sharp, and a tail extending to an enormous length. Having slaughtered the shepherd of a flock, it devoured many sheep.
Wow,
So this is one
animals.
mean, nasty creature, right? And an enormous creature at that.
Yeah.
But that's consistent with what we see in the fossil record of these massive creatures we call dinosaurs. But notice they quite expressly called it a dragon.
Yes.
And so the list goes on. I've got others there as well. But
Yeah, so these are, again, not, within 1,000 years or something like this. So what's the timeline for these dinosaurs? Because you're saying that actually the fossils we find, you need a big watery catastrophe. We've only got one flood. So they all die in the flood. But we do have these dinosaurs surviving past the flood
yes,
as
so
well.
how does that fit? Yeah,
Yes.
right. That's a good question. In fact, from an evolutionary point of view, if you were to try and correlate a dinosaur with these descriptions, you have a big problem.
Yeah, well,
these
they're
have to
buried,
survive for millions of years before Marco Polo gets to see one.
You've got 65 million years worth
yeah,
of
exactly.
other fossils.
So they think.
Yeah. So how could you
it
see a
doesn't
dinosaur
work,
now?
right? Doesn't work.
Yeah, they have to be mythical creatures.
But the biblical account makes good sense of it. And the way that works is this. The Bible tells us that God brought a pair of every kind of creature to Noah, and they went on board the ark. Now, Noah didn't go out on safari to round them up, right? They came to him. They went on board the ark, and they were the only animals that land-dwelling, air-breathing animals that survived the flood, right? And they came off the ark. So they would have then commenced to repopulate. Now, not all of them would have survived, but enough of them did to become the basis of these dragon legends and the sightings like Marco Polo's and so on.
So I have to ask you the question, because this gets asked a lot, is how did you get the sauropods on the ark? Was the ark big enough for the sauropods?
Well, it's a very good question, because people have this mental picture of a little leaky bathtub, a couple of giraffes neck sticking out the top, the ark, the children's book kind of picture. But once again, you go back to the history book of the universe, read what the Bible says about the ark. It was a huge vessel, at least 140 metres long. It was more than sufficient to take a pair of every kind of animal. And by the way, it's been estimated that there would have been no more than, say, 8,000 different kinds of animals since creation. Some people think a lot less. So the Ark has only, say, 16,000 animals on board, and the average size of those would be a lot less than that of a sheep, and yet a vessel that big today can carry over 120,000 sheep. So it's more than sufficient for the task. So the first thing to bear in mind is the Ark was a huge vessel. Second thing to bear in mind, as I mentioned, God brought a pair of each kind to Noah. So all they had to be able to do when they came off the Ark was to reproduce. Now, dinosaurs came from eggs. The largest egg is probably the size of a football or so, and therefore the big ones were actually small once. So God just needed
some babies.
Well, yeah, but maybe not babies, but perhaps more like teenagers. So they were on board the Ark for a period of just over a year. So they come off the Ark and they're capable of reproduction either immediately or not long afterwards. Say you've got teenagers, possibly before they even went through their growth spurt. So they didn't have to be huge creatures. And I think the third thing to bear in mind is that there aren't that many different kinds of dinosaur. This is kind of interesting because paleontologists in their enthusiasm have been naming all the finds they make, and we were getting this proliferation of different species of dinosaur. And in more recent years, there's been a bit of a realisation that a lot of these were actually not different species at all, but the same species, but in different stages of development and growth. And a very famous dinosaur professor, Jack Horner, says that he believes maybe some of the order of a third of the dinosaur species are actually not separate species at all, but just different stages of development. So we have the number of kinds of dinosaur actually is shrinking. So there's possibly only maybe 30 to 50 different kinds. So when you take those three factors into account, very large vessel, that even the big ones were small ones, they only had to reproduce when they came off the Ark, and there aren't that many different kinds, then it's not that big a problem.
Okay, Mark, so you're saying the Bible gives us a clear history that matches the evidence that we see dinosaur fossils rapidly buried by a flood, and we have sightings of dinosaurs afterwards because they would have survived the flood, and they're presumably died out now.
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully on the way home from the studio we won't run into a T-Rex.
Wow. So I guess, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but I guess what I want to get onto is you also, we've been talking about history. We're talking about science and history, the evidences from science and history for dinosaurs dying out much more recently than evolutionary worldview. But you also said there's biblical evidence. Now, a lot of people wouldn't take biblical evidence as being evidence, but as Christians we would. So can you tell us about the biblical evidence?
Yes, that's right. That's the third of the lines of evidence that I was going to cover. We have talked about how the Bible's record of history makes a lot more sense of the evidence we see in science and history. But people often ask, well, are dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? And I believe they are. And if you look at the book of Job, in chapter 40, there's a description of this extraordinary creature called Behemoth. And the context is that God is revealing to Job his works of creation, presenting to Job, I am the creator of the universe and of everything. And he begins by saying to Job, look at Behemoth. Now, maybe there was one of these creatures within sight at the time. Sounds that way. And he says, which I made along with you. Now, the Bible tells us that God made all the land-dwelling creatures on the sixth day of creation, along with mankind. So that kind of stacks up. And it talks about how it's a herbivore, eats grass like an ox. And then a little bit further down it says, it sways its tail like a cedar. Now, a cedar tree is a huge tree. In fact, the cedars of Lebanon were used to build the temple and Solomon's palace and so on. They're enormous trees. So the picture is of an animal with a massive tail. You might remember in the quote that I read out earlier on, the historical record, the writer spoke of the enormous tail on this creature. So here you have a description that is consistent with what we see in sauropod dinosaurs. Now, I have a Bible at home which has some footnotes. You need to remember it's the scriptures themselves which are inspired by God and are inerrant. The footnotes are not. They're just comments and views from theologians. And it says, possibly a hippopotamus. But if you look at the tail of a hippopotamus, it's a stubby little thing. You wouldn't describe that as a cedar tree. And someone else has suggested maybe it's an elephant. But an elephant tail is like a piece of rope. You wouldn't describe that as a cedar tree. So the description in Job 40 of Behemoth is consistent, I believe, with the sauropod. And why would God have pointed this out? Well, it's the greatest of the animals that he made. So he's described to Job the wonders of his creation, including this enormous thing that he made, depicting, of course, an example of God's own power and might. If you move on to the next chapter in Job 41, you see the description of an extraordinary thing called Leviathan. And this creature is so ferocious that you cannot hunt it. Some commentators have thought maybe it's a crocodile, but it can't be a crocodile because people have hunted crocodiles to near extinction. And the description of this thing is extraordinary, including that it's a fire-breathing monster, that its breath will set coals ablaze, that sparks shoot out of its mouth. Is such a thing possible? Well, actually, I think it is. And there's a lovely little example. There's a little beetle that you find in South America called a bombardier beetle. And you might think, what's that got to do with a huge creature like Leviathan? Well, this little beetle has a fascinating defence mechanism. There are 2 chambers in its abdomen which contain liquids which, when combined, spontaneously combust. So when he senses that he's about to be eaten by a prey, he fires off this very hot toxic gas straight into the predator's mouth, and of course it has the desired effect. Now, there's an amazing animal discovered in the fossil record called a Sarcosuchus imperator. It's an enormous crocodile-like creature, so it's both aquatic and it also comes onto the land. But it has large bulbous features on its nose, which scientists do not understand the function of these things. Various theories abound. But just what if that was a similar mechanism to the bombardier beetle? And maybe that was, in fact, the source of the fire breathing that this creature might have had. But we find legends littered with stories of fire-breathing dragons. And, legends often come from a seed of truth. Maybe this thing really did just what the Bible says, and it was a fire-breathing dragon.
Wow.
So there's an interesting thought. But I think the Bible does describe dinosaurs.
Yeah, well, the example of Job 40 seems like you can't have... What other animal? Is there any other...
No, there's nothing else that fits the description.
Yeah. Okay, so there's examples of dinosaurs described in the Bible, and that's the biblical evidence.
Yes.
Okay, so we've looked at scientific, and that was soft tissue, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones.
Intact DNA.
Intact DNA in dinosaur bones. The fossil record. Actually, the biblical worldview of the fossil record makes a lot more sense. We looked at history, and you're talking about historical accounts, the pictures and depictions, medieval art, and the Bible, that there's actually descriptions of dinosaurs there, Job 40 and 41.
Yeah.
So I guess the 41 you were saying, Sarcosuchus was Leviathan, which is not necessarily...
Could be.
Yeah.
Likely candidate, yeah.
But is that considered a dinosaur or just an old...
Well, it's an aquatic creature, so perhaps technically not dinosaur, but it's an amazing monster.
But the Job 40
looks very much like a sauropod, yes.
Okay, wow. So thanks, Mark. So that's 3... So there's quite a few reasons why you think that dinosaurs actually only died out recently.
Absolutely.
And Mark, we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Where can people go to understand more of this, to look at it more, answer some of the questions they have? Because it's quite a big shift. If someone's listening to this and they've being taught that, we get taught that in school, dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago. It's this ancient period. It's in the fossil record. Where do we go to look for this information on this alternative view?
Well, there are our website at creation.com is a gold mine of resources. So I'd always recommend people go there. But one of the most valuable resources we have is the Creation Answers book. And it consists of 20 short chapters that address the most asked issues or questions that Christians and even non-Christians have. Things like, does God exist and so on. And chapter 19 is, what about dinosaurs? Now, we're going to make that available to viewers as a free ebook. And there's information in the description below how to get a hold of that. But we also have this wonderful publication, which is quite recent, called Titans of the Earth, Sea and Air. And this is the latest book that we've produced, and it contains up-to-date information about dinosaurs. It covers the topics that we've talked about today, evidence in the fossil record and so on. I heartily recommend it. It's a beautifully illustrated book and is a wonderful asset to anybody's library.
Yep. And I believe people can also get if anyone's interested in the book we were talking about, Dire Dragons, that's also available on our
website as well.
And I've not read this one, Titans, yet. I look forward to reading that. But that Dire Dragons one, I just had to look at the pictures and I could understand what he was saying. That's quite a very convincing resource that I think people could even give to other people. But Mark, thank you so much for your time and explaining these 3 lines of evidence of why you believe dinosaurs only died out recently, very recently, in the last 1,000 years.
Yes.
Not 66 million years ago.
That's right.
So thanks a lot for your time.
That's the key.
Yeah.
The Bible's record of history is trustworthy and the evidence supports it right from the very beginning.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.